Patterson. So our speaker's topic is very intriguing to me. And so I took a stab at appropriate opening and closing words. So this first poem the author was Henry Scott Holland, who lived in, the 1800s. And he was a priest at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And this was not intended as a poem, but it reads like a poem. It was actually delivered as part of a sermon in 1910, and it was entitled Death, the King of Terrors. And it was preached while the body of King Edward VII was lying in state at Westminster. Death is nothing at all. It does not count. I have only slipped away into the next room. Nothing has happened. Everything remains exactly as it was. I am I, and you are you, and the old life that we lived so fondly together is untouched, unchanged. Whatever we were to each other, that we are still. Call me by the old familiar name. Speak of me in the easy way which you always used. Put no difference into your tone. Wear no forced air of solemnity or sorrow. Laugh, as we always laughed at the little jokes we enjoyed together. Play, smile, think of me, pray for me. Let my name be ever the household word that it always was. Let it be spoken without an effort, without the ghost of a shadow upon it. Life means all that it ever meant. It is the same as it ever was. There is absolute and unbroken continuity. What is this death but a negligible accident? Why should I be out of mind because I'm out of sight? I am but waiting for you, for an interval, somewhere very near, just around the corner. All is well. Nothing is hurt. Nothing is lost. One brief moment and all will be as it was before. How we shall laugh at the trouble of parting when we meet again.
Thank you, Linda. That was lovely. Now I will turn it over to John, who will introduce our speaker.
Well, we're very fortunate today to have with us Will Kanwischer. Mike? So you've all seen what his topic will be today, and I think we're all looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Will's a graduate student at UNC, associated with the Parr Center for Ethics. He's interested in ethics and the history of philosophy. He is particularly interested in accounts of well-being and our duties to promote it, as well as issues related to the connection between agency and time. Will originally comes from Ohio, not too far from Detroit, and
it's just the intro.
Is in his third year now at UNC, about to start work on his dissertation, which is a big undertaking. But he's found the time to join us here today and share his thoughts with us. So, Will, it's all yours.
Hopefully this will remain stable for the duration of the talk. Can everyone hear me all right? Wonderful. No? Should I speak up a little? Maybe get a little closer to the microphone? Okay. All right. All right, how about this? Is this better? Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for the warm welcome, in particular for the beautiful opening remarks. I hope we'll return in the course of the talk and the Q&A to some of the thoughts expressed by the quote that was read. But as you know, today I'll be talking about a philosophical problem that I've been working on and thinking about since I was an undergraduate. And that's the problem of whether it's possible for us to act in ways that wrong the dead. And part of the reason I think I'm drawn to this question time and time again is that it invites us to think about a real broad range of philosophical issues. So, of course, ethical issues. In order to figure out whether we can wrong the dead, we need to know what it means to wrong someone, the conditions under which it's even possible for us to wrong someone or for someone to be the kind of being that can be wronged. It also invites us to think about the metaphysics of time, the nature of time's passage, what kinds of things exist, whether things in the future and past exist in the same sense that things in the present exist. It invites us to think about personal identity, the conditions under which something persists over time, in particular, when that something is a person, what makes it the case that I'm the same person that's being wronged after my death, just to name a few sort of issues, rabbit holes that you can go down once you get started on this train of thinking about whether it's possible to wrong the dead. So in this talk, here's my plan. I'm going to sketch the contours of the problem, whether it's possible to wrong the dead. And I'm going to raise a few philosophical puzzles that philosophers have traditionally grappled with when trying to give a satisfying answer to this question. And of course, I have a view about whether it's possible to wrong the dead. And I don't think it'll be hard to guess what my view is once the talk gets underway. But my real goal is not really to defend that view at length.
It's all right.
Instead, I want to give you some sense of what's at stake in the debate in thinking about our moral relationship to the dead. And I want to raise a few problems that I invite you to sort of pick up on and think about in the Q&A. But if you want to hear more about my reasons for, my obviously correct view, you can ask me about it in the Q&A. So let me begin with an anecdote, and I hope the anecdote will bring out a particular feature, what I think is a common feature of the way we think and talk about the dead. My grandfather was a very eccentric guy. He was an oil painter and a sculptor, sort of Dadaist, abstract expressionist painter. And when he died, he left behind a mountain of these paintings and sculptures in his home studio in Illinois. And after his funeral, my father and I rented a box truck and drove across the country. My father's also an artist, so this was very important to him. We rented a box truck and drove across the country to retrieve all of this work so that we could safely store and preserve it at our home in Ohio. And the box truck didn't have a working radio. We could only pick up FM, and the air conditioner didn't really work either. So this was a pretty miserable trip in this big rattling box truck. I was maybe 11 or 12 at the time. And I distinctively remember asking myself why we were going to so much trouble to save these paintings. And the answer seemed pretty obvious. It seemed that we owed it to my grandfather to preserve his work. It wasn't just that it would be a good thing to do or that it would make us happy. It seemed that we had a duty to him to preserve his life's work and to make sure it wasn't, thrown out. And I think that upon reflection, we'll see that talking about the dead in this way is very common. If our customs and cultural conventions are any evidence, we owe the dead a great deal, or at least we seem to owe the dead a great deal. So, for instance, we're bound by law to distribute a dead person's property in the way they see fit. There are strict legal prohibitions on the use of corpses in experiments or as organ donors without ante-mortem consent. And we sometimes talk in terms of our duties to the dead veterans and heroes of our wars or our founding mythology. You might think we have a duty to remember and be thankful for the sacrifices of people who went before us. This isn't to say that these conventions are all obviously correct. I'm just trying to sort of point out a current in our institutions and thought seems present. So this way of speaking shows up in more interpersonal contexts as well. So if I use my friend's death, this is a sort of a morbid example. If I use my friend's death as an opportunity to sleep with his widow, I don't just do something wrong. I seem to betray him. That seems like an appropriate description of my act as a betrayal. And what all of this suggests, I think, is that most people think we have duties to the dead. But how, and this is the sort of central question of the talk, how can we make sense of the idea of duties to the dead? After all, you might think there's something strange or even paradoxical about thinking that we could have duties to people who feel no pain, disappointment, or anger. And perhaps it's even more incoherent to suggest that we have duties to people who do not exist. How can I have a duty to something that doesn't exist, after all? So maybe these intuitions I've been trying to bring out, these practices, are just sort of manners of speech left over from a time when most people were committed to theism and the existence of an afterlife. right? And that's a view that no good naturalistic, 21st century philosopher should take seriously. Sorry, that was a joke, but it's nonetheless an unpopular view. And you might wonder whether there's a kind of tension between rejecting the idea of the afterlife and continuing to believe that we have duties to the dead. As you might expect, I think that's a little too quick. But before we address these concerns, I think we should be more careful about what exactly we're asking, the kind of view we're considering. So to say that we could wrong the dead, or that we have duties to the dead, seems to say something more than the claim that we merely have duties that involve or refer to the dead. Instead, to say that I can wrong the dead in the sense I'm interested in is to treat the dead as what the philosopher Tim Scanlon calls a member of the moral community. It's to claim of them, the dead, that they can be mistreated, that they can be the victims of wrongdoing, and not just involved causally in wrong action. Recent work in moral philosophies tended to draw this distinction in terms of what are often called directed and undirected duties. So a directed duty is a duty owed to a particular person, and a duty that, if not performed, entails that that particular person has been wronged. Directed duties and their associated wrongs are often thought to be connected to reactive attitudes, like resentment and hurt feelings. One crucial sign, at least, that a directed duty has been violated is the fact that it would be appropriate for some person to demand apology, or to feel resentment. Undirected duties, on the other hand, are not owed to any particular person, and when they go unperformed, no particular person is licensed in demanding apology or recompense. To borrow one of Scanlon's funny examples, if I fill the Grand Canyon with cement, I've acted wrongly. I've done something I ought not do. I hope you'll at least agree with that. But I've not wronged any particular person. There's no one person who can demand an apology on behalf of the Grand Canyon. So to more clearly and cleanly state the view under consideration with some of this terminology borrowed from contemporary work on moral philosophy, to say that we can wrong the dead is to say that we have directed duties to the dead, duties which, if not performed, wrong particular dead people. For the sake of brevity, let's just call this view the posthumous wrongs thesis. That's just shorthand for the view that the dead can be the object of these directed duties. So one thing we should be careful about, and one thing that we should notice up front, is that we could accept the weaker claim that we have duties involving the dead without accepting that those duties have the directional or relational character that I've been discussing, right? This will turn out to be important for one of the puzzles I raise later. But you might think that, in fact, we should make sense of all of this talk I've been pointing to about a last will and testament, or about owing it to the heroes of our wars. We might try to make sense of all that talk without committing ourselves to the view that we really would wrong the dead by failing in these duties. Perhaps it would just be good for us to remember our relatives, or perhaps it would just be good for us to distribute property in the way that the dead person requests, even if this isn't something we owe to the dead person themselves. Okay, so let me move to the first puzzle, which I've mentioned already, and I think is, in a sense, the trickiest of the three puzzles that I'll introduce. So this problem concerns the fact that according to our sort of common sense view of what the world is like, the dead do not exist. And the puzzle stems from the fact that it's not obvious that it makes sense to talk about duties to beings that do not exist. You might think it verges on incoherence. I don't, but you might. So it actually might come as something of a surprise to you that it's a highly controversial matter among philosophers whether the dead exist. And this isn't because, as I suggested earlier, lots of philosophers believe in an afterlife. So it's going to get we're going to have to do a little metaphysics here, and you'll have to bear with me. If I use any sort of terms of art that are unclear, you'll have to ask me about them in the Q&A. But hopefully it'll be, accessible and intuitive. So according to the most popular view of the metaphysics of time, which is a view called eternalism, moments in time are not objectively past, present, or future. And the objects located at these moments are all equally real. So if eternalism is true, and of course that's a big if, then it seems we have a response to this initial puzzle, because it turns out that if eternalism is true, it's not the case that the dead do not exist. The fact that the dead are in the past doesn't mean they don't exist, in the same way that the fact someone is very far away does not mean that they don't exist. So one way of understanding the idea behind eternalism is that space and time are fundamentally similar. So distance in time is like distance in space. Someone who's very far in the past it's like they're very far away. And if you're curious about why philosophers sort of overwhelmingly endorse this kind of kooky sounding view of the metaphysics of time, without going into too much detail, it has to do with some results in theoretical physics in the 20th century. So it turns out, thanks to our friend Einstein, that we have really good evidence that whether two events are simultaneous depends on the frame of reference from which they're observed. And explaining that, the first time that was sort of said to me, it took me a long time to sort of understand what was being said. So I'm not gonna in the interest of keeping the talk clear, I'm not going to go into the details of why these experimental results seem to obtain or why we have evidence to believe them. But suffice it to say that if that's right, if simultaneity is relevant or relative to a frame of reference, then it seems like it would follow that whether two objects are in the present would depend on the frame of reference from which they're observed. If you combine that fact with the claim that only objects in the present exist, it turns out that what exists is relative to a frame of reference. So that's a sort of reductio of this view that only present objects exist. That's supposed to be a bad result. Maybe you don't think that's such a bad result, that what exists is sort of subjective or relative to a frame of reference. But philosophers working on this issue have generally not been eager to embrace that as a consequence of their views. And so they've gone in for this, admittedly a little counterintuitive, but ultimately perhaps justified view on which past, present, and future doesn't make a difference to existence. But perhaps we don't find that view of the metaphysics of time attractive. Perhaps we're too attached to common sense to follow, the crazy philosopher in denying that there are objective differences between the present, the future, and the past. The view that there's an objective now and that only objects located at this objective now exist is called presentism. It's a pretty simple name. So if presentism's right, then it is true that the dead do not exist. And now we should ask, okay, let's sort of follow the presentist in this assumption. Let's suppose that the dead don't exist. And now the question we should ask is, does this really doom the posthumous wrongs thesis after all? Would this in fact show us that we have no duties to the dead? I'm not so sure. So natural language is full of sentences that appear to claim that we stand in all sorts of relations to the dead. I have a few examples. So one is, I love reading about Napoleon. If presentism is true, Napoleon doesn't exist. Nonetheless, I can read about it. Is this fact puzzling? I'm not sure. Maybe we can return to it in the Q&A. I don't think this fact is particularly puzzling. Here's another. It's even stronger. I admire Alexander the Great. Right? If presentism is true, Alexander the Great does not exist. He's not located at the present. Only things located at the present exist if presentism is true. What do I admire? Is there something incoherent about my admiring Alexander the Great? Maybe you think so. But hopefully for metaphysical reasons, and not because you just think it's incoherent to admire Alexander the Great, right? You're my father's murderer. In this case, I'm attributing a relation to the dead to someone else. You stand in this kind of murderer relation to my father. My father was not murdered. This is a toy example, don't worry. So those who endorse this kind of presentist metaphysics, those who think that only present objects exist, they need to give some account of how these sentences can come out true. Right? It would be unacceptably implausible if they said everything you just said is false, right? That would be a sort of bad result for their view. So whatever that account turns out being, however they make sense of the truth of these sentences, it isn't obvious that the defender of the posthumous wrongs thesis can't help themselves to that account, right? So whatever the presentist says about relationships like admiring or murdering or loving, we'll need some reason to think that the wronging relation that we're interested in, this directed duty relation, can't be accommodated by this account of these sentences. Right? So why not think, just as it can be true that I admire Alexander, even if Alexander does not now exist, that I can wrong Alexander, even if Alexander does not now exist? That's a motivation for the first puzzle, right? So just to sort of recap, I'm seeing some confused looks, which are worrying, but just to sort of recap, right? So the question is, doesn't this view just sort of fail to get off the ground? Doesn't it sort of crash and burn immediately? Because there's something nonsensical about thinking that we could stand in these kind of dutiful relations or wronging relations to the dead. So we considered two possibilities of how we might make sense of the connection between time and existence. The first option was eternalism. That's the view that everything located at every moment in time exists equally. There's no objective difference between present, past, and future. If that view is true, the puzzle is dissolved, right? Because it's not true that the dead don't exist. So there's nothing puzzling about standing in that kind of relation. So then we considered the sort of more hostile option to the view under consideration. We considered the view that seems intuitively to clash with the posthumous wrongs thesis. But I just gave you at least the beginnings of an argument that we shouldn't be too quick in thinking that if presentism is true, if only present objects exist, that it's impossible for us to wrong the dead. But all that's sort of schematic, right? So I've been arguing that the bare fact that the dead do not exist on some accounts of the metaphysics of time doesn't rule out the possibility that we could wrong them. And I've motivated this conclusion by pointing out how no matter which view of the metaphysics of time we adopt, we should admit that some sentences attributing so-called relational properties like being the murderer of or being admired by. So some of these sentences attributing these relational properties to the dead are true. But perhaps there's something special about the relation we're considering, the wronging relation, that precludes wronging the dead, and which would not apply to relations like admiring or being the murderer of or being the father of, being the son of. And here's one suggestion about why wronging might be sort of special in this respect that's been popular among philosophers. The suggestion is one can be wronged only if one is harmed, right? So if you're wronged, you're harmed in every case. If we adopted a view, so here's one suggestion about why this wronging relation is special, or one distinctive feature of this relation. You can only be wronged, you can only have one of these directed duties violated if you've been harmed, made worse off. Yeah, your well-being impacted in some negative way. Sorry. So if we adopted a view, if we combine this suggestion with a view of harm on which one could be harmed only at times when one is alive, this combination of claims would pose a serious problem for the posthumous wrongs thesis. So for example, suppose we have a view of well-being, which is commonly called hedonism. It's not the pejorative sense of hedonism, it's a sort of technical philosophical sense of hedonism. So suppose we thought that the only sort of things that are good in themselves for us, the only things that contribute in themselves to our well-being were pleasures and pains, right? So if we adopt this kind of hedonism, an action or state of affairs would be better to the extent it contains more pleasure, and worse to the extent it contains less pleasure or more pain. Depends on how you spell out the view. So since pleasure and pain are mental states, and since the dead lack mental states, I hope that's uncontroversial too, they're incapable of feeling pleasure or pain. So if we restrict harms and benefits to pleasures and pains, and if we restrict wrongs to harms, then we have a simple argument against the posthumous wrongs thesis, right? That's a sort of intuitive argument that many philosophers have in fact been convinced by. So there are two ways you might try to resist this argument against the posthumous wrongs thesis. Maybe you think it ultimately succeeds, but I'll give you two reasons to be at least cautious here. First, we could argue that hedonism is false, right? Either by showing that it's wrong or by supplying a more attractive alternative that allows for the possibility of posthumous harms and benefits. So hedonism's often been down, but it's never really been out. So I'll leave it to all of you to undertake the difficult task of conclusively refuting it once and for all. Have fun. But luckily for us, we don't really need to make up our minds on the question of hedonism's truth, because I think there's another easier option, which is to deny the claim that one can be wronged only if one is harmed. So this is a sort of similar strategy to the first puzzle, right? I was saying, look, even if this view of metaphysics, which is unpopular, is true, I don't think it dooms the posthumous wrongs thesis. Similarly here, I'm saying, look, even if this sort of controversial view of well-being is true, I don't think this dooms the posthumous wrongs thesis. And the reason I think we should be careful about positing too close a connection between being wronged and being harmed is that it seems to clash with many of our intuitions and sort of intuitive judgments. So, for instance, we often feel like we've been wronged when we're the victim of heavy-handed paternalistic intervention. I certainly do. Maybe I'm just like a defiant or something, you know. But we often feel wronged when we're the victim of sort of overly heavy-handed paternalistic intervention, even when I suggest this intervention is really what is in our best interests, right? So that suggests it might be possible for you to have a kind of claim of the sort we associate with directed duties, even when one is made better off. So that would be trouble for this view that you can be wronged only if you can be harmed. And we can also be wronged, it seems, by prudentially neutral actions, actions which just make no impact on our well-being whatsoever. To use one of the philosopher Christine Korsgaard's examples, suppose we work in an office and I refuse, I'm just sort of, dogmatic and, I'm a jerk. I refuse to let you borrow a paperclip. You're sneaky though, and you wait until my back is turned and you take one. You sneak one off my desk. It seems you've wronged me, right? You've stolen from me. You've acted against my wishes about how my property is to be used. But who could think plausibly, right, that the loss of one paperclip is a serious harm? Not only a serious harm, but who could think it harms me at all to have one, paperclip? The world where I have, 500 paperclips and the world where I have 499 paperclips look like they're equally good for me. But it seems I've been wronged. So I think both of these kinds of intuitions give us a reason to think there's not such a close connection after all between being harmed and being wrong, being wronged and being harmed. Perhaps you're unconvinced though. So maybe to suggest one sort of avenue of attack, one way to resist these kinds of intuitive judgments is to suggest that there's a difference between harmlessly wronging someone whom it is possible to harm and harmlessly wronging someone whom it is impossible to harm. You might think that's an important difference. After all, numbers and piles of sand cannot be wronged. They're not the kind of things to whom I have duties. And here's a real plausible explanation of the fact that I don't have any duties to numbers or piles of sand. Things can't go well or poorly for numbers or piles of sand. So that seems to suggest it's not only whether you're in fact harmed which matters. So you might think it's whether it's possible in principle to harm you, whether you're the very kind of thing that can be harmed that matters. But given our above cases, I think it isn't clear why this should be true. Why posit this deep conceptual connection between being harmable and being wrongable if one need not be harmed in any particular case in order to be wronged, right? So I'm happy to talk about that more in the discussion. I know this is a bit of a technical point, but I'll leave things here for now to introduce the sort of third and final puzzle. Right. So recall, as I've argued, that there's no contradiction in thinking that we have duties involving the dead, but denying that these duties are owed to the dead themselves. So this was the sort of view I suggested right at the beginning, right? Maybe we should let people write binding wills, last wills and testaments because things go better overall for everyone when we do so, not because we owe it to any particular dead person to distribute their property in the way they see fit. But perhaps this view is not only coherent, so I've suggested, there's nothing contradictory in holding this view, but perhaps we find it more attractive, in fact, than the posthumous wrongs thesis, the view I've sort of been pushing. So after all, I've just shown how the posthumous wrongs thesis faces these sort of deep and troubling objections that require saying controversial things about the nature of time and what it means to be harmed. Wouldn't it be simpler, easier for everybody to just adopt a view according to which all of our talk of wronging the dead is really a kind of metaphor? So consider what I'll call the disjunctive view, which says that every case of putative wrongdoing done to a dead person is really a case of either a wrong done to a living person or a case of undirected wrongdoing, like filling in the Grand Canyon with cement. So in every case where it looks like I might have a duty to the dead that I violated, in every case where it looks like I might wrong the dead, either I've really wronged a living person or I've done something that's just wrong, but the wrong doesn't attach to any sort of particular person. So such a translation of our talk of wronging the dead into either of these two kinds of classes of cases seems available in any putative case of posthumous wrongs. And it seems like it's both simpler and less controversial than the view I've been defending, right? So notice that in order to hold that view, you don't have to say anything about the metaphysics of time. You don't even have to get into this whole, headache-inducing debate about whether past objects exist or how to make sense of the truth of sentences that attribute properties to objects that maybe don't exist. I think this is probably a good argument. In fact, I'm very tempted to accept its conclusion. But I think it's open to the following kind of challenge, and I'm curious to hear whether you think this kind of challenge succeeds. So imagine two cases of wrongdoing, two cases of wrong action that are totally identical, but for one fact. So in the first case, my grandfather's on his deathbed, and he's asked me to retrieve and preserve his artwork. Knowing that it would be a lot of trouble for me to do so, and being a sort of bad person, upon receiving assurances that it would take a miracle for my grandfather to recover, I have the artwork taken away to a dump the day before his death. He never learns of my action, let's just stipulate for the sake of the argument, that he never learns of my action, and he dies thinking I've kept my promise. It'd be a horrible thing to do, I think you'll agree, but let's suppose I do it. I would never really do it, but let's suppose I do. So in the second case, imagine my action being alike in every detail except for one fact. And that's that I have the artwork taken away the day after his death rather than the day before. So in the first case, I have all of his art sent off to the dump the day before he dies. He never finds out about it, and he dies thinking I've kept my word. And in the second case, everything is the same, except I sort of arrange for the garbage truck to show up the day after his death. So the view under consideration, the view I'm calling the disjunctive view, right, requires us to give a radically different explanation of the moral facts in each of these cases, right? So the first case, the case in which I have his art trashed before he dies, even by the lights of the objector, is a wrong done to a living person. It's a case of genuine wrongdoing done to a living person. My grandfather's wronged. He's still around, right? He's still around to be wronged. And most of us think you can be wronged without knowing about it. So even though he doesn't find out that he's been wronged, you might think that poses no obstacle to thinking I violated a duty to him. That itself is controversial, and we could talk about that. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A as well. But in the second case, the same analysis, in the second case where I do it after his death, we can't give the same analysis of the case. It's mere wrongdoing, or else I'm wronging someone who's alive. So perhaps I'd be wronging my father by who is alive in the case by throwing away my grandfather's art. Or perhaps I'd be doing something that's merely wrong, something I ought not do, right? Most of us think you just shouldn't destroy things like artwork. It would just be wrong to do so, even if no particular person will suffer from it. So is it plausible, I ask, and this is the sort of question I'll leave you with before Q&A, is it plausible that we should account for such similar cases in such different ways? I mean, I'll leave that for you to decide, but at the very least, I think it's worth pointing out that simplicity and giving an uncontroversial account of a case is not the only sort of virtue of an explanation. Explanatory unity, the ability of an explanation to explain similar cases in similar ways, should count for something too. So it's not so simple in my view as the disjunctive view sort of swooping in and making everything easier for us, right? Relieving us of all of these controversial commitments. Because if we adopt this disjunctive view, if we think that every case that looks like it might be a case of wronging the dead is really a case of wronging the living or doing something that's simply wrong, we have to give very different accounts of very similar cases. And that's something we should be nervous about in the same way that we should be nervous about committing ourselves to controversial claims about the metaphysics of time. So those are my three puzzles. Like I said, you can probably guess which view I hold, but I'll leave it there. And I'm very curious to hear what you think about these puzzles, which of them you think are convincing, whether you think there are other sort of problems facing the posthumous wrongs view. But now I'll just thank you for listening. Yeah, sure. So the first puzzle, you might call it the puzzle of existence. Okay, great. Sorry. So the first puzzle, I sometimes call the puzzle of existence. And the problem is simple. It's just how is it possible for us to wrong a being that doesn't exist? If we think that the dead don't exist, isn't there something incoherent or contradictory in thinking that we could wrong them? The second puzzle concerned how it could be possible to wrong the dead if it's not possible to harm them. And the problem arose out of the fact that on a lot of very plausible looking accounts of what it means to harm or benefit someone, the dead cannot be harmed or benefited. So I mentioned just one account, hedonism, which is the view that only pleasures and pains are relevant to well-being. That excludes the dead, since the dead don't feel pleasure or pain. You can't, make a dead person feel pain, no matter how hard you try. But there are actually other views that will generate the same result. So some people think it's the satisfaction of your desires, the satisfaction or frustration of your desires that matters to whether your life goes well or poorly. And on some versions of that view, the dead can be harmed or benefited. But on others, versions on which you have to hold the desire at the time that it's satisfied in order to get the benefit, the dead are also going to be excluded because the dead don't have any desires. The dead don't have mental states. That was the second puzzle. And it was more generally about the connection between harm and wrongdoing and whether, supposing we think that the dead are immune from harm, we can't make their lives worse or better, which is itself controversial, but supposing that's true, might we still be able to make the case for the view that the dead can be wronged? And the final puzzle was about sort of a simpler explanation. So I began by running through all of these cases in which it looks like, or at least we talk as if we have duties to the dead. And the worry was, one way of explaining those judgments is that we really do have duties to the dead. They're true. You could analyze all those sort of institutions we have that distribute property in the way dead people see fit. I think we have duties to our dead family members to do things like remember them, take care of what they cared about after they're gone. But you could sort of take those on board, but give a sort of debunking explanation of our intuitions. You could say, look, we talk as if we have duties to the dead, but we don't really have any duties to the dead. We have duties to living people that involve the dead, right? So I might, owe it to my siblings to take care of my grandfather's stuff. Or we can just say, it's just wrong. It's just bad. Maybe the world goes worse to the extent that we don't care about people who are no longer here. And if that's right, it looks like we can get everything we want, right? So we started by sort of saying, how can we vindicate these common sense judgments about the dead? And the response is sort of, well, we can vindicate them without saying all this, mumbo jumbo about the metaphysics of time and existence. We can just give a much simpler explanation. And I suggested a problem with thinking that it is uncontroversially the better explanation of these judgments. So those were the three puzzles. Maybe there are more. In fact, I'm sure there are more. I think there are more, but I'm curious to hear what all of you think about them.
Thank you again, Will. That was really terrific. Yeah. So we pause here to pass the baskets, and I remind everyone we're an all-volunteer organization. We receive no money from any other organization, and we survive due to the commitment of our members and friends who help us out with volunteer activity and putting a couple bucks in the collection. We're going to now proceed with the Q&A. I just want to reinforce the ground rules. Maura will be bringing the mic around. Please wait for the mic so that our Zoom audience can hear questions. Remember to ask only one question at a time. And we also will go to different people before we go back to the same person with a second question. So with that said, back to you.
Should I
Okay.
call on people or will the chair? You
We're going to start with John, since John is the sponsor of the speaker.
That was a great talk, and you raised a lot of very interesting points. Regarding, I guess it's your second puzzle. We recently in our book club here read a biography of Martin Luther King. And it's clear that during his life, people told falsehoods about King, knowing they were false, because of their own agendas. Now, they wronged him, and you could argue they harmed him also, in that it may have even, these falsehoods may have even contributed to his death. But after he died, let's say that the biographer who wrote that book put in information that the biographer knew was false, but because of that biographer's own agenda, he decided to put those falsehoods in there. Now, clearly, in my way of looking at it, at least, that person is harming the memory of Martin Luther King. Now, you never use that word memory, but clearly he's harming the memory of King. And by putting falsehoods into a biography that may be read by thousands of people, he's changing the perception of that dead individual in history. And that to me is a clear wrong to that dead person. But the way I would put it more naturally is you've wronged the memory of that person. So
Yeah.
what do you feel about that?
Yeah, I certainly think it's right that in performing an action like this, we could wrong someone, but so it sounds like perhaps the disjunctive view I mentioned at the end could easily accommodate this kind of fact. So maybe you think it's a little unnatural to talk in terms of wronging a dead person rather than talking in terms of wronging a dead person's reputation, wronging their memory, wronging the public perception. And that seems like it's perhaps more metaphorical. We should maybe give that a more metaphorical cast than talk about like wronging someone in this robust sense of violating a duty we owe to them. And one way we might try to sort of make sense of this thought is that, well, in all kinds of ways, someone's reputation or memory contributes to sort of how much good there is in the world, right? So you might think it's incredibly important that people have a positive view of Martin Luther King Jr. given, you know, his accomplishments and his importance to fighting for equality and social justice. And insofar as you sort of weaken the power of his memory, and perhaps to just give one example of how you might think this story goes, to weaken the power of his memory and inspiring others to perform similar actions, you're doing something that's bad. And we could think that without thinking that we've wronged the person in question. So that's a way of sort of, I think that's a good case that sort of, it counts in favor of the disjunctive view. I think the disjunctive view, that kind of debunking view, can give a nice and natural explanation of this. But I'm also, I mean, so I mentioned my own view is that I think it is, when we talk about harming someone's reputation, I think we are using metaphor in a way that we're not using metaphor when we say, you know, it harmed him to have fallen off that building or something, right? But reputation certainly plays a role in lots of cases of like putative wrongs to the dead. Lying about someone after they're gone, making up, you know, vicious rumors in order to ruin their reputation among people who cared about them while they're alive is certainly, hopefully any view will capture cases like this and yield the verdict that they are in fact wrong. So that's what I have to say about that kind of case.
So thank you again for your talk. I wanted to give two things. An example of the first argument, when you were speaking, it made me think of children who have like object permanence, right? So when you disappear and say peekaboo, they really think you're gone and they don't think you're there. And so maybe there is some of that in our world up into a certain point. And then we evolve into something else. We use another way. Your third argument, I can give an example, a personal example. I had a son who passed away a couple years ago. And one of the things that I remember doing was when he was alive, I would sit by his bedside. He was in the NICU for a long time. So I would sit by his bedside every single day, all day. And then when he passed, I would go to the gravesite every day. And so it was like I continued that, you know, that ritual, whatever I was doing to soothe myself. Because at first it was mostly my son, but then after he passed away, it's definitely me soothing me and taking care of what I was going through. So I feel like that third argument, it makes sense. Like we're really just trying to, at least for me, make sense of, at some point I was going to have this child and have this way of life. And now that's gone. So I'm trying to do something to make up for what didn't happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So thank you. That's a good example.
I think that's a good kind of case as well. And sort of another thing that maybe counts in favor of the kind of disjunctive view. What I'll say about it is one reason we might worry about giving a similar analysis of all cases is that in some cases, it's going to turn out that it's just uncontroversially not in our interests to do what we think we might owe to the dead. So in many cases it is. And there's nothing wrong with saying both, I think in lots of cases, both that it's just good for us to do something like, distribute someone's property in the way they see fit. That's a example I return to so much because it's just so, ubiquitous. But there's no tension between saying both that we owe it to a dead person to distribute their property in this way and that it's good. But there will be cases in which it's just, we should all agree that it's not in our interest to do what we owe to the dead. So in some cases, like, we know that by violating the terms of a will and testament, we could make everybody better off. Some people write will and testaments that are like stupid and like don't result in, the greatest overall benefit to the people involved. And I think in those cases, we still feel some pull to sort of do what the dead person has asked. So I certainly think that's right in tons of cases. In so many cases, it is sort of in our interests as well to do what we think we owe. But I think there are some cases in which it's not. And in fact, we might go to a lot of trouble to do what we've promised dead people to do, or to do what it was their wish that we do. So yeah, it's definitely a good case to think of.
So I would suggest that the term that you use, wronging the dead or doing something that's unethical, is I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Is something that is by itself defined, because wrong implies there's more than one person involved. If you imagine there was only one person on Earth and there's no hope for there ever being another person, even filling the Grand Canyon with cement is not a problem, because really it would be how that might affect others. And so it's a relational thing. The ethical value, or the fact that we even have ethics, is related to the fact that there's more than one person. If there was only one, it wouldn't matter. So when you say wronging the dead, well, no, what you're wronging is a wrong implies that you're interacting in some way that's not good to others that are alive. So I think your last example, where you say that really it's how we're dealing with other living people, is the crux of the matter. So,
Well, so I have three things to say.
okay.
I have three things to say. The first is, many philosophers have been convinced that in fact you can wrong yourself. You can perform actions that violate duties you owe to yourself. So here's a sort of uncontroversial example, and then I'll give you a more controversial example. So the uncontroversial example: many people think you have a duty to take care of yourself. Who is that duty owed to? Maybe it's owed to other people. Not obviously, though. You might have a duty to yourself to care for yourself. People often talk about this in terms of self-care, right? You owe it to yourself to sort of step back and make sure that your interests are accounted for. I'll give you a more controversial example. So the philosopher Immanuel Kant, one of my favorite historical philosophers, thought that it was wrong to kill yourself. He didn't just think it was wrong to kill yourself. He thought you owed it to yourself not to kill yourself. Many subsequent philosophers have disagreed with his view about that, but it's at least a position on the table that you could wrong yourself. And it's still relational. You stand in all kinds of relations to yourself. I'm identical to myself. That's a sort of boring relation, but that's a relation that we should be prepared to treat as a relational property. I like myself, I hope. I think I like myself okay. That's a kind of relation I stand into myself. So the mere fact that wronging is relational, I think, does not entail that it's impossible to wrong. I'll say one more thing. So I actually don't share the intuition that if I were the only person on Earth, filling in the Grand Canyon would be permissible. I think I would still be doing something sort of horrific. And maybe the Grand Canyon's like sort of a silly example, but I would say if I were the last man on Earth and sort of walking through the Louvre with a box cutter defacing beautiful Renaissance masterpieces, I think I would be doing something wrong. Even if I knew that no one would ever find out or no one would ever suffer as a result. I mean, I cringe in the same way that you do at the thought of doing something like that. And what that might show is that, one thing it might show is that not all wrongs, not all cases of impermissible action. So setting aside whether you can have these kind of directed duties, think not all duties are related to well-being. I think we have some duties that don't depend on the effects of our actions on other people. There was another thing I was going to say, but I forget what it was. So of a duty. Yeah, so here's one. I think I have a duty not to tell lies, even when they're benevolent. But even if I could make everyone happier by telling a lie, I think I ought not do it. And when I think about why I shouldn't lie, when I think about like justifying this belief I have, I don't reach for, well, it's good for people to know the truth. Maybe that's an available justification, but I actually think it's sort of more basic. I owe people that I tell the truth to them. So there are all these kinds of cases, and I motivated a few of these in the talk, cases in which it looks like we wrong someone, even though our actions are prudentially neutral, or even in cases where our actions are prudentially good, they increase the amount of well-being in the world. It seems like we could act wrongly. That's not to say like this view is conclusively defeated or anything. These are very controversial matters, but I think at least if you're willing to follow me in saying these things about cases that involve the living, what I'm trying to do is show there's much less difference between the cases that involve the living and the cases that involve the dead than we might think.
I'm going to start handing the mic over on this side because we have Mary and you and Judith and Linda.
I'll make
But-
my responses briefer as well. I'm sorry.
No, this is fine. It's very interesting. But because I am holding the mic, I'm taking that advantage. So my mother died when I was 21. So my brother was just about 25. And he always, from probably the time he ever saw a motorcycle, wanted one. And what she said to him throughout his teen years was, "You would kill me if you got a motorcycle." And he is going to be 58 this year. He has never gotten a motorcycle because no matter the fact that he's been an atheist since he was like 4, he's pretty sure she would haunt him if he got a motorcycle. And so he still feels the feeling that he would harm her somehow, even if she's not here.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a familiar, like, it's hard for me to overstate what a familiar feature of our sort of thought this is. I think it's certainly controversial. My talk would be boring if it were uncontroversial, whether we could wrong the dead. What I think is uncontroversial is that we seem to think that we can wrong the dead, or we seem to think that we have duties to people who are dead. Whether that turns out to be the result of like lingering superstition or something, I think is open to inquiry. But I think at least if you just look at our practices, I think we have to take this view seriously. We have to at least ask whether these kinds of actions are justified or whether this kind of reasoning is justified. So yeah, there's so many cases. And I love giving this talk because people always give me like new interesting cases of ways in which they think their actions are constrained by the wishes of the dead. Thank you.
A couple random thoughts from my own experience. In your example of some other young man and his grandfather's art, did this young man tell the grandfather that he was going? There's not. Okay.
Did he make a promise? Yes.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
yeah. So
okay.
we're supposing everything's the same
Okay.
promise.
Okay.
The promises are made at the same
Okay.
time, with the
Okay.
same facial expressions. The only difference is in one case, I'm sort of trying to get the variables under control like a
I hear you.
scientist.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I didn't catch whether there was a promise made. So I think I would like to live in a world where when I pass away, people will make a reasonable effort to do what I wanted. And so I feel a little obligation to try to have that as a value, hoping that it will happen to me. And, my nephew who died as a young man recently wanted to, so they did make phone calls. They found out he didn't quite qualify. It didn't happen, but we tried. And that felt, to try to do what he wanted to do. The other thing is this more psychological rather than philosophical. When something happens that my mom, who passed away 4 years ago, would have loved, we say, Mom would have loved that. She would be so happy to see us all getting together. And that's a pleasure, knowing that we're fulfilling something she would have loved, just because we enjoy thinking about how she would react to it. So it seems like it's more than textbook.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've been interested in, as I've thought through this topic, is the extent to which we can say that the dead have a point of view from which things could be good or bad or objectionable or not objectionable. I think there is a sense in which like we can make sense of this thought. There is, you know, it's not an actual point of view. Well, it depends whether you're an eternalist or a presentist. Like everything, it depends whether you're an eternal or presentist. But you might say it's not a present point of view, at least. It's not a here existing point of view. But I think there is a sense in which we can do what you do, which is evaluate how our actions would strike someone who's no longer dead. Would my grandfather have an objection to the kind of action? If were he alive, would he have an objection to the kind of action that I'm about to perform? I think that actually turns out to be very important to the story of why it's possible to wrong the dead.
Yeah. I I like visiting graveyards, so as I walk around the architecture and you see a lot of neglected graves, and I find that rather poignant, and wonder if people, assuming they're alive, are neglecting their duty to that person. So one time I was rolling around a graveyard in Chicago, and I saw a cameo. I went over and I looked at it. It was a cameo of a young woman who died in 1916. And it struck me as sad. When I came back a few years later, I went to the graveyard and I sort of went to that grave and I found the cameo in pieces. Apparently, whoever took care of the yard went over it. And so I collected the pieces and took them back here and then put them together, returned to Chicago, put them on the grave. And every time I go to Chicago, I visit that grave. Now, I felt a relationship with that dead person, both intellectually and emotionally. I felt she had been harmed, her image destroyed, her memory wiped out. And I cannot help feeling that same way today. I think we do have a duty to the dead.
One very interesting feature of this case is that before this person's death, you had no connection to them. So you notice that in my examples, and many times it was the case that my putative duty to the dead, I'm not going to beg any questions, but my putative duty to the dead was generated by an interpersonal relationship, right? It seems like in some sense, because he was my grandfather, that I ought to preserve his art. What the interesting point that your comment raises, I think, is that it's not obvious that all duties to the dead involve interpersonal relationships that were established before death. And in some cases, perhaps it's possible to enter into an interpersonal relationship with someone after they've died. So you have a kind of history of interaction with this woman who died in 1916, despite the fact that you never met her, never knew her, didn't know anything about her wishes before she died. Some philosophers writing on this topic have tried to run everything through interpersonal relationships. And for reasons like the case you just mentioned, I'm not sure that can be the whole story. So I think this is a very interesting, the extent to which our history of interaction with a dead person before their death matters to the kinds of duties we have to them after their death. I think that's a fascinating question.
Okay, so what I'm going to say next is rhetorical, and it's just as a statement because it's another philosophical way of thinking about such things. And then I want to say one more thing after that. So if dead people actually exist, does that dead person stay the same person as he or she was at the time of death or before dying on this planet? And if that person does not stay the same, because you never can stay exactly the same, and if that person exists, it would be unusual to stay exactly the same. So that brings the question, all right, maybe if you are wronging that dead person who was that way or that felt that way at the time of death, does that dead person still feel the same way about whatever it was? And so how could you harm a person, a dead person, when you don't really know if they've evolved in a way that isn't that way of thinking, that whatever you do or don't do would harm them? That's just what I was thinking about. Also, you're thinking about, when you're talking about harming the dead, you mean dead people, humans, right?
Yes. Well, you could, I leave it open.
Well, the reason I asked
Harm
that
dead animals. I leave
is
it.
from indigenous community, American Indian community. Everything's related and we're all one of the same family. Everything interacts or interconnects with everything else, humans, animals, insects, so on. And so harming the dead in case of filling in the Grand Canyon or something, that would be similar to ruining something very beautiful in nature, brings a different way of thinking. And yes, then you would be harming something dead because you destroyed it even further or something. So those are the things that I was thinking about while you were talking, among a million other things that we don't have time for right now. But I just think in terms of myself, and I've thought about this a lot, especially I'm 83, so I get closer and closer to the time I won't be here on this planet for sure. I'm an atheist, so I'll be dead. I'll just be plain dead. And it won't matter to me what people do. It won't matter at all. So I can't be harmed because I'm dead.
It won't matter to you at the time that
say,
the actions are undertaken.
Say that again.
So it won't matter to you at the time after your death. When
Yeah.
these events are unfolding. It
Yeah.
might matter to you before your death. What happens after your death?
Yeah. No.
Not at all.
No, because it's everybody's choice. You can't
Certainly.
make people do what you wish they would do. Look at our legal system and politics right now. You can't make people do things. And whether or not someone wishes to do or not do something is none of my business. I can express while I'm alive what I wish, or try to set an example of kindness and things that are important, and inclusiveness that I hope people will model after. But after I'm gone, even now, it's their choice. I see people doing some things that are really harmful to themselves and so on, but there's only so much you can do.
Do you feel similarly about promises?
About
if someone's
promises?
made a promise to you, do you think it's none of your business whether they keep
I think while I'm alive, if they've promised not to tell a confidentiality that is only between that person and me, I would feel harmed.
but just psychologically, it wouldn't matter if they revealed it after your death.
After I'm dead, it wouldn't bother me because I'd be dead.
Yeah.
So that's how I was thinking about it, just in terms of personal feelings, and not, I mean, I wouldn't have any feelings. I wouldn't be there.
So let me give you a little motivation for thinking that you should be bothered by it.
Okay.
There's a little bit of motivation.
More worries, right?
More worries, more puzzles. Yeah, always. When you're hanging out with a philosopher, the puzzles never stop. So here's a little reason to think that maybe is too quick. So do you think that you could be harmed? Let's leave aside wronging for now. Do you think that you could be harmed by something that you never learn about?
Something that I never
never learn about, never discover.
Something
An infidelity that's successfully concealed.
Oh.
Perhaps, is a case.
After I'm dead?
While you're alive.
While I'm alive. I would be troubled. I would be
Well, you won't be
troubled.
literally troubled because you never learn about it. But thinking about this case, you would think something's gone wrong. Perhaps you've been harmed.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
There's this case, the philosopher Shelley Kagan gives this pair of cases, two lives, the two men aptly named Jake and Fake. Jake lives in a, nice suburban neighborhood. He's got a white picket fence and a loving wife and children. Sort of dies, ripe old age.
The Hallmark
Bouncing
version of life.
Yeah, he has a Hallmark life.
Okay.
Fake, on the other hand, has exactly the same beliefs and feelings as Jake. So from the inside, their lives are identical. Every belief that Jake has, Fake has, and every feeling of pleasure that Jake has, Fake has. However, Fake is being deceived on a massive scale. In fact, his wife hates him and is frequently, cheating on him. His children don't respect him and despise him. All of his, nice Hallmark neighbors that seem like they respect him really, snicker about him behind his back. But from the inside, we could suppose their lives are exactly alike. Now, Kagan's view is, upon reflection about these cases, we'll think that Jake has a much better life than Fake does. He thinks if we were given a choice between two phenomenologically identical with respect to mental states' lives, one in which we really have the Hallmark life, supposing you think the Hallmark life's good, you can just fill in whatever kind of life you think is good, and a choice between one in which we merely believed we had the Hallmark life and never found out that it was all a lie, he thinks overwhelmingly we'd choose the real life. We'd choose to really have what we think we have rather than just to think we have something and take pleasure of it. And if you follow him in having that verdict, maybe you don't follow him in having that verdict. You say, look, what's it to me? Maybe. I think that's a possible response, is to say, look, this is a sort of fanciful case, not too closely connected to the actual world. Maybe if you really could guarantee me I'd never find out, and from the inside, my life would feel just as good and seem just as good to me as it would if I really had these things, I wouldn't care. But he at least thinks most people will follow him in thinking Jake's got a way better life. Like, it's not only that Jake has a better life, like Fake's, there's something really wrong with Fake's life. In fact, like the fact that he's being massively deceived in this way, like, is catastrophic for his well-being. And if you think that's right, then the fact that you don't care about something in the sense that it never sort of makes it into your mental states or something like this, it's not obvious that that's good evidence that it doesn't affect your weal or woe, or it doesn't impact your well-being. So that's a bit of the start of a reply to your question.
So I've thought about that in a bigger context, and that is certainly in certain religious circles that I have some family and friends, they live in a bubble, and that is their reality. It, to me, has nothing to do with my reality or what I see as the greater universal reality on this planet. But they live there, they're happy there, they die there. And it makes me wonder, do we all just create our own bubbles and live in them? And then whatever happens and attitudes happen.
We've got Linda and some people with Chris on Zoom in the queue, and so we're okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll have to eat fast.
Sorry, everybody.
I just want to reflect on what I'm hearing, or I think I'm hearing, and that is when people talk about wanting to do something for someone who has passed away, some of that sounds like the tapes in our heads. Our mother always said blah, 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 and we're just not pulling ourselves away from that.
Mm-hmm.
And that strikes me that you could also believe in, and I'm forgetting the word, where you believe in the past, that people exist in the past, the present, and the future.
Eternalism.
Eternalism, thank you. So I just think that's kind of interesting. That
Yeah, it actually relates to part of the quote you read at the beginning, right? I think the quote was, death, I'll just be in the other room.
Still here.
I'm still here. I'll just be in the other room. And the thought of the eternalist is that something very similar is true of dead people. They're not here, but of course, people in Australia aren't here. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. They exist at a different time, but that's not to say that they don't exist. Right?
Yeah, filling in the Grand Canyon would be a bad idea because
I think so.
I just have something quick. Yeah, for those of you who want to do any homework, you can go to Amazon and for a small nominal fee, watch the movie Waking Ned Divine, which is an exploration of this very issue.
I've never heard of it. Oh,
Yeah, it came out in 1998.
Waking Ned Divine. It's an awesome movie.
Thank you again, Will. That was really terrific and
Thank
interesting
you, everyone, for the
discussion.
wonderful questions.
And I apologize if I wound up cutting some people off, but remember, we have refreshments, so you can try to buttonhole Will then to continue chatting. So we've come to the announcements time of our meeting. Jennifer. Sorry.
Very quick. So this is just a shout for the Change for Change. We are supporting this quarter the North Carolina Community Bail Fund of Durham. Thank you. So the bail fund, they help post low-cost bail for people who could not otherwise afford it and return people to their homes and communities so they do not sit in jail for small amounts of bond. So if you would have any extra change, please drop it in the jar and we'll appreciate it. Thank you.
And we've got Chris over here.
I'm going to stand up here rather than hide near the Zoom thing. We're having, Jennifer is going to be our crop walk person. And so I picked up the t-shirt, well, a t-shirt for the crop walk the other day, and our name is on the back as a sponsor. So I'm just wanting to pass that. I'm giving this packet to Jennifer so she can help push this thing along and encourage you to walk. So just want to make that quick announcement.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jennifer. Before I hand the mic over to our president, do not come here next Sunday. We will not be here. Next Sunday is Zoom only. We'd love to see you on Zoom. Darwin Day, sadly, is on Monday instead of next Sunday, but we're still sort of honoring it. We're going to be doing a brief TED Talk that has some connections with some evolution discussions, and then we'll be talking about it. So it'll still be fun, even if only on Zoom.
Just a brief announcement. Next Sunday at 3:30 is a board meeting. Our board meetings are open. Anybody can attend. And if you have any issues, thoughts for how you would like our society to go, feel free to pass it along to one of the board members or show up. It'll be on Zoom.
And hold on, Chris.
Just kind of a save the date announcement. Poor People's Campaign is holding a rally in Raleigh, March 2nd, and I hope we can get a group there to further their campaign against poverty in the state and in the country. And I also want to thank everybody who brought food today for the IFC. We really need to get back on top of that. They haven't recovered yet from pandemic levels, and it's still needed very much.
I got an email just before the program here. The place we rent here, Extraordinary Ventures, they're having a group meeting right after we are. People will be coming in at 3:30 to start setting up for that. So we have to be wrapped up pretty much. I mean, that doesn't mean we have to have everything out of here, but we have to really work on getting out of here as close to 3:30 as possible. Today.
Okay.
Nothing like a little notice.
Yeah. All right, I will turn it over to Linda for closing words.
If I could speak double time, I would, but so this was written by a woman who was inspired by a friend's father's obituary on Facebook. The father had requested, in lieu of flowers, please take a friend or loved one out to lunch. Here's the poem. Although I love flowers very much, I won't see them when I'm gone. So in lieu of flowers, buy a book of poetry written by someone still alive. Sit outside with a cup of tea, a glass of wine, and read it out loud by yourself or to someone or silently. Spend some time with a single flower, a rose maybe. Smell it, touch the petals, Really look at it. Drink a nice bottle of wine with someone you love, or champagne, and think of what John Maynard Keynes said, "My only regret in life is that I did not drink more champagne." Or what Dom Perignon said when he first tasted the stuff, "Come quickly, I'm tasting stars." Take out a paint set and lay down some colors. Watch birds. Common sparrows are fine. Pigeons, too. Geese are nice. Robins. In lieu of flowers, walk in the trees and watch the light fall into it. Eat an apple, a really nice big one. I hope it's crisp. Have a long soak in the bathtub with candles, maybe some rose petals. Sit on the sit on the front stoop and watch the clouds. Have a dish of strawberry ice cream in my name. If it's winter, have a cup of hot chocolate outside for me. If it's summer, a big glass of ice water. If it's autumn, collect some leaves and press them in a book you love. I'd like that. Sit and look out a window and write down what you see. Write some other things down in lieu of flowers. I would wish for you to flower. I would wish for you to blossom, to open, to be beautiful.
Okay, our meeting is over. So let's break and have refreshments while we can. And oh, thank you to Jan